There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but only one way to truly live, to belong to no one. I learned this lesson too late. By the time I understood it, I was already chained, already dragged into the bowels of a ship that was not a ship, a vessel that had long since shed its imperial skin and grown new flesh under the claws of the dark gods. I was once a conscript, little more than a number stamped into a ledger of the Astra Militarum. My regiment was broken on the wastes of some nameless planet, our lines shattered under the green tide of orcs. My transport was crippled in orbit, taken by raiders whose armor bore no heraldry of the Emperor. Their hulls screamed with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon. Their warriors howled prayers in voices that shook marrow. That was the last moment of clean memory I had. After that, the dark swallowed everything. Now I am awake, and the walls themselves are breathing. Chains bite into my wrists. The manacles are not of simple iron. They are etched with scars that glow faintly, symbols that whisper when I close my eyes. The air is hot, metallic, and reeks of old blood. I hear groaning in the distance, not just human throats, but the groaning of metal under stress, the ship's bones cracking as if alive. They call this place the Harbinger of Ruin, though some mutter it has other names in older tongues. It is a chaos warship, once a proud cruiser of the Imperium. Now its form is half metal, half cancerous growth. Ribbed walls pulse faintly with veins that carry not coolant, but something far thicker, darker. I am not alone. Hundreds of us, survivors, prisoners, broken souls, are lashed to benches in this cavernous hold. The overseers, men who were once human, watch with eyes that glow faintly like hot coals. Their armor is scavenged from imperial stores, but corrupted, twisted. The Aquillas defaced with jagged runes of corn or slashed with the 8-pointed star. They carry whips that spark with caged warp energy. I saw one man try to stand, screaming for freedom. He lasted less than a heartbeat before his flesh boiled away, his soul torn from his throat in a shriek that rattled the rest of us. There are no speeches here, no inspiration, no promises of glory. There is only survival. The days blur together. The ship is a labyrinth where light dies, corridors shift when you're not looking, and doors appear that lead only to screaming mouths. The air ducts whisper. I sleep, and I dream of things I cannot describe, shapes too vast and voices too soft to bear. When I wake, I am less myself. And yet, I am not weak. That is why I have lived this long. I learned the ship's rhythms. The overseers demand work, scraping rot from the ship's living walls, hauling ammunition to the gunnery decks, dragging corpses into the recycler engines that grind them into paste for food. The rations taste of iron and despair, but to refuse is to die. Competence here is survival. You must work swiftly, silently, with enough strength that the overseers find you useful, but not threatening. Too weak, you are meat. Too strong, you are noticed. And nothing noticed here lives long. I am not alone in this calculation. There is Kale, a voidsman who claims to have served aboard Imperial frigates before capture. He knows machinery, and he shows me how to listen to the hum of the reactors. If you hear the wrong note, he says, it's not a fault in the machine. It's something waking. There is also Sarah, thin,
haunted, her skin inked with half-faded tattoos of a hive-ganger. She watches everything, and when fights break out among the prisoners, she knows where to step to be unseen. Together, we cling to each other in the dark, for the dark is endless here. And then the whispers begin. At first, I think they are dreams, but Kale and Sarah hear them too. Faint murmurs in the bulkheads, carried on the hum of the warp drives. They do not speak in words, not at first. They are suggestions, half-formed hungers. Kill, take, serve. The others begin to crack. One man chews his wrists until the chains cut to bone. Another begins to laugh without stopping, his voice echoing even when his throat splits and blood pours out. The overseers do not intervene. They watch with cruel amusement, as if this is expected, welcomed. I feel it too, a pressure in my skull, a hunger I cannot name. Sometimes I want to strike Kale in his sleep, to crush his windpipe just to hear the silence. Other times I want to kneel, to whisper to the shadows and let them answer. But I resist, for now. The Harbinger of Ruin is alive, and it is hungry, and we are inside it. Not passengers, not crew, but offerings. This is the brutal truth. Life aboard a Chaos warship is no life. It is a slow dying stretched over endless days, each heartbeat a battle to remain human. And every day, I feel that battle slipping further away.
The whispers did not fade. They grew louder. At first, they slithered in only when we slept, curling around our dreams like serpents. Now they gnawed at us, even in waking hours, seeping through vox grills, vibrating along the plating beneath our boots. They promised power, freedom, indulgence. They demanded sacrifice. The Harbinger of Ruin had crossed into the warp. You can always tell. On Imperial vessels, warp translation is a controlled procedure. Psychers chained, Geller fields raised, prayers intoned by 100 adepts. Even then, accidents happen, and whole crews vanish into madness. Here, aboard a warship enslaved to chaos, there is no such restraint. The transition was agony. The air warped into glass shards against the lungs, gravity bent sideways, and half a dozen prisoners ruptured into fountains of gore as the ship's flesh tore through their bodies. We screamed, and the overseers laughed. From that moment, reality was thinner. Corridors no longer obeyed geometry. Sometimes we would march to the mess and find ourselves at the shrines instead. Shrines not of gold and light, but of rusted iron, skulls nailed to living walls, incense thick with blood smoke. The whispers had names now. I heard them clearly. Slanesh, whose voice was silk over razors, promising pleasure. Korn, whose growl was hunger and fire, demanding blood. Nurgle, whose chuckle was rot, offering release from pain. And Tietzinch, whose whisper was endless lies, telling me every truth I wanted to hear. It was not just me. Kyle began to twitch, his eyes rolling white whenever the warp drives howled. He said, "It's singing to us. Can't you hear the harmony? The ship wants to show us things." Sarah grew restless, prowling the hold like a predator, her gaze too sharp, too intent. Once I caught her licking blood from her hand after a fight among the prisoners. When I asked, she said, "Better not to waste it. We're all wasting away already." I fought it.
I prayed to the Emperor, though no shrine remained aboard this vessel. I whispered scraps of hymns I remembered from Schola sermons, clinging to words like lifelines. The Emperor protects, the Emperor sees. But each day the words rang hollower. The overseers did not stop the madness. They encouraged it. When two prisoners tore each other apart in the feeding lines, the guards cheered. When one man fell to his knees and carved the 8-pointed star into his own chest, they gave him freedom from his chains and let him away. I never saw him again. Perhaps he joined the cultists who chanted in the shrines. Perhaps worse. Then came the first true manifestation. It began with a smell: sulfur, copper, and rot. The air shimmered, and the Vox units crackled with laughter that was not human. A shadow pooled in the corner of the hold, darker than void, and from it crawled something. Not large, but wrong. Its limbs jointed in too many places, its mouth splitting sideways across its chest. It wore the tattered remnants of a prisoner's uniform. It was one of us. Or had been. The panic was instant. Men pulled at their chains, women shrieked, some fell into prayer, others into hysteria. The creature scuttled forward, snapping jaws, its eyes black pits that bled smoke. The overseers did nothing. They watched. This was entertainment. And then Kyle acted. He had scavenged a tool, a shard of metal filed to an edge. With it, he cut free one wrist and then launched himself at the creature. His movements were precise, desperate, but trained. He had fought in void ship corridors before. I saw the skill, the competence of a man who had once known order. He struck hard, driving the shard into the creature's eye and then ripping sideways as ichor sprayed. The thing shrieked, a noise that bent the air, but Kyle did not flinch. He pressed his weight, tearing until the creature convulsed and collapsed. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of escaping vapors. For one heartbeat, I felt hope. Kyle had proven that even here, skill and will could hold back the dark. But then I saw the overseer's grins, and I saw Kyle's eyes. They burned too bright, lit by something beyond mortal fire. He trembled, and when he looked at me, I knew he had heard the whispers more clearly than any of us. Still with us in the darkness, I ask you, listening now, hit that like button if this tale chills your soul. For aboard the Harbinger of Ruin, the whispers had only just begun, and soon blood would flow.
Blood was inevitable. The Harbinger of Ruin did not permit peace. The ship thrived on violence, and its crew, if that word even meant anything anymore, was divided into factions that worshipped different gods. At first, they tolerated one another, bound by the warship's eternal voyage through the warp. But pressure builds, always, until it must erupt. The eruption came in the feeding hold. We were herded there in chains, the prisoners shuffled into long lines beneath the pulsing pipes. The slop poured into troughs, thick and red, smelling faintly of copper. Some whispered it was the recycled dead, flesh and bone ground into gruel. I forced myself not to think about it. To eat was survival. That day, two rival cult groups collided over the feeding lines, one daubed in crude symbols of corn, their skin scarred with fresh cuts,
the other cloaked in rags smeared with filth, chanting the name of Grandfather Nurgle. The words became shouts, the shouts became blows. Then the knives came out. Chaos erupted. Chains rattled, voices shrieked, blood splattered against the walls that pulsed in delight. The overseers did nothing, standing aside as though this was the will of the gods. Perhaps it was. Kale shoved me down, his voice sharp, "Stay low, survive." But Sarah did not stay low. She leapt into the fray, her wiry body moving like a predator. She seized a shard of bone from the ground and drove it into a Khornate's throat. The man fell, gurgling, and she snatched his blade, turning to slash at another. Her face was feral, eyes wide, lips pulled back in a grin that was too wide. I had no choice. A Nurgle cultist broke free from the melee, lumbering toward me with a rusted cleaver, his skin bloated with sores. He reeked of rot, his breath a cloud of decay. My chains were still locked, but I seized a broken length of pipe from the ground and rammed it upward into his jaw. He choked, staggered, and I struck again and again until his skull caved. His blood was black and thick, splattering across my face. I expected horror. Instead, I felt alive. The whispers hissed approval, warm against my ear. Yes, strong, kill to live. This is truth. I nearly believed them. The fight became a slaughter. The Khornates hacked down their rivals with brutal strength, but the Nurglites would not die cleanly. They laughed as their entrails spilled, rising again with impossible endurance, until only fire or decapitation put them down. The feeding hold became a charnel pit, blood knee-deep, steam rising as the ship absorbed the offering. And then Kale revealed himself. He wrenched free his chains entirely, the metal shattering as though it had rusted away in an instant. In his hands, the shard of metal he had once wielded was no longer a tool. It glowed faintly, runes etched into its surface. I knew then that the whispers had answered him. He had accepted their bargain. He moved like a storm. His strikes were surgical, cutting down cultists from both sides. The Khornates roared his name as if he were a chosen champion, while the Nurglites shrank back, hissing. Even the overseers watched him with wary interest. And Sarah, oh Sarah. Her grin was madness now. She joined Kale, slashing and tearing, her voice rising in a chant I did not understand. She was not fighting to survive anymore. She was exulting, offering herself to the madness. I felt the pull. The whispers promised me strength if I joined them. They told me the Emperor had abandoned me long ago, that my blood was all I had left to give. If I offered it freely, I would not only survive, but thrive. But I clung to what little I had, to memory, to the idea that beyond this cursed ship, somewhere, humanity still lived. That perhaps the Emperor, in his unreachable throne, still cared for the forgotten. The battle ended only when the cult leaders themselves arrived, towering figures clad in warped armor, one bearing a chain axe dripping with warp fire, the other dripping pus from a corrosive iron mace.
Their duel tore the hold apart. Metal screamed, the walls bled, and prisoners fled in every direction. In the chaos, I broke my chains. I don't know how. Perhaps the metal itself gave way. Perhaps the ship wanted me free. When it was over, the floor was slick with corpses. The surviving cultists dragged the bodies away, singing praises to their patrons. And I, shaking, drenched in gore, realized the brutal truth. On a chaos warship, survival is never clean. It is bought with blood, your own or another's. And with every drop spilled, the gods look closer. The tension builds. I whisper to you now, my unseen listener. Subscribe to witness more tales from the dark millennium. For the Harbinger of Ruin was not yet finished with us.
The Harbinger of Ruin hungered, and the warp was listening. After the slaughter in the feeding hold, the ship descended into frenzy. Cult banners rose across its decks, the cornates daubing walls with fresh blood, the nerg lights spreading rot through the air ducts. Yet it was not victory for either side. The real master of the ship was the warp itself, and it had been roused by the offering of so many lives. The first sign came in the gunnery decks. The overseers drove us there to haul shells the size of coffins, their surfaces etched with chaotic runes. The air was thick with ozone, sparks leaping from void shield coils. Then came the storm. The warp outside screamed. Lightning without light crawled across the viewports, claws of energy raking at the hull. The ship bucked like a beast in agony. Men and women were thrown across the decks, bones snapping, blood spraying. And through the static howl, we heard them. Voices layered upon voices, overlapping like a choir of madness. Feed us, bleed for us, give us your flesh, open the gates. Kale stood tall amidst the storm. He had changed since the feeding hold, his movements sharper, his eyes glowing faintly with unnatural fire. He worked the gunnery machines with a precision I had never seen, hands flying across controls as though he had been born to this vessel. Competence turned to something greater, something unholy. He barked orders, and even the overseers obeyed. Shells slammed into chambers, void lances roared, and the Harbinger returned fire into the screaming void. I wanted to believe he still fought to live, but his smile told me otherwise. Sarah was worse. She danced among the panicked prisoners, her blade flickering in the stormlight. Every time lightning ripped across the viewport, I saw her differently, sometimes human, sometimes stretched and warped, her grin splitting wider than her skull allowed. She whispered to me in the chaos, her voice barely audible over the storm. Don't fight it. Let it in. The ship wants us. The gods want us. Why die as cattle when we can rise? I said nothing. My hands shook on the shell I carried, my mind screaming with prayers to the Emperor. But the prayers felt small, drowned beneath the roar of the warp. And then the walls opened. Not doors, walls.
panels of rusted iron tore like skin, and from the wounds poured creatures, demons, half-formed, clawing their way into reality. Some were small, leering things with too many teeth. Others were masses of tentacles that dripped ichor, burning holes in the deck. One loomed above us all, a figure of molten brass and shadowed flame, its axe dragging furrows in the floor. The hold became a battlefield. Prisoners screamed and ran. Overseers fired their warp-crackling whips, cutting down both slaves and demons alike. Kale roared, hurling shells like boulders, his body glowing with stolen power. Sarah shrieked with joy, carving her way through both friend and foe, her laughter echoing across the deck. And me? I fought because I had no choice. A demon lunged, its claws slicing chains like silk. I seized a fallen overseer's whip, the handle hot in my hand, and lashed out. The energy burned across the demon's skin, its shriek cutting into my skull, but it faltered. I struck again, harder, until its form collapsed into ash. For a moment I felt powerful, alive. The whispers surged. Yes, more. You are chosen. You need only accept. But I resisted, barely. The storm raged on, the ship tearing through the warp like a wounded beast. The shrines to the dark gods flared with unnatural light, runes pulsing, demons clawing their way through every crack. Whole decks were lost. Prisoners were dragged into walls that swallowed them whole, their screams echoing down corridors that no longer obeyed sense. Through it all, Kale grew. His voice thundered like a champion's, his strikes breaking demons with inhuman force. I saw the overseers bow their heads when he passed. He was no longer prisoner. He was becoming something more, something terrible. Sarah clung to him, her eyes fever-bright, whispering prayers to names I dared not speak. And me, I was left behind, clinging to my humanity like a man clings to driftwood in a storm. Every moment the choice gnawed at me. Surrender and live as something else, or resist and die as nothing. Comment your theories below, I whisper now. What corruption stalks our heroes? Because the Harbinger of Ruin was not merely carrying us through the warp. It was delivering us into the jaws of damnation.
The Harbinger of Ruin had become a slaughterhouse. By the time the warp storm ebbed, half the decks were lost to fire and madness. All sections of the ship howled with demonic laughter. Corridors twisted back upon themselves. Vox units bled whispers that no human throat could speak. And yet, the vessel pressed on, driven by a will that was no longer mechanical, but utterly malevolent. I had survived. Barely. The whip I had stolen from an overseer still crackled faintly in my grip, the handle seared into my palm. Each time I used it, I felt the power surge, promising more, demanding more, but I resisted. I would not become what the ship wanted me to be. Kyle no longer resisted. He stood before the surviving prisoners on the shrine's deck, a silhouette wreathed in warp fire. The shard of metal he had once carried had become a weapon of impossible design, a blade that shimmered as though forged of screams.
He raised it high, and the cultists roared his name. "Kielos," they chanted, "Kielos the Chosen, Kielos the Deliverer." He had a new name now. He had a new purpose. And he looked at me not as a companion, but as prey. Sarah was at his side, her body already marked by change, her limbs too long, her teeth too sharp, her laughter echoing in tones not entirely her own. She whispered into his ear, and his smile widened. Together, they were no longer human. They were acolytes of chaos, leaders of the damned. The choice came swiftly. The overseers dragged the remaining prisoners before Kiel, laying us down at his feet like offerings. He spoke with a voice not his own, each word reverberating with a dozen echoes. "Serve or burn." Some dropped to their knees immediately. They carved runes into their flesh, swearing allegiance to the dark gods, their faces alight with ecstasy. Others resisted, and they were torn apart, their blood feeding the shrines. I stood among them, whip in hand, my heart pounding. Sarah's eyes found me. She tilted her head, smiling with teeth too sharp. "Don't be a fool," she said softly. "The Emperor left you long ago. The gods are here. They will lift you up. Don't waste yourself." Kielos stepped forward. His blade shimmered inches from my throat, his eyes burning with warp light, boring into mine. He said, "You've survived this far. You're strong, strong enough to rise beside me. Take the oath or die." I cannot tell you what made me choose. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the last ember of faith that still burned in my soul. I raised the whip and I struck. The lash cracked across his chest, searing flesh, splitting armor. For an instant, his expression was shock. Then came the roar, a sound that shook the chamber. He swung, his blade carving a screaming arc. I ducked, the air splitting where my head had been. I struck again, sparks flying, demons shrieking from the walls as if my defiance wounded them too. The shrine blazed with unholy fire. Sarah lunged, her claws raking across my arm, but I drove her back with a scream. I knew I could not win, but winning was not the point. The shrine's walls pulsed, veins glowing, symbols burning. The ship itself watched us, and in that moment I chose to deny it. I hurled the whip into the heart of the shrine, into the pulsing rune that anchored the warp storm. Light erupted, white and pure, not from the gods of chaos, but from something older, a fragment of faith I did not know I carried. The shrine exploded. Fire and shadow consumed everything. When I awoke, there was only silence. I do not know how I survived. Perhaps the Emperor heard me. Perhaps the warp toyed with me. The Harbinger of Ruin drifted, scarred, its decks in ruin. Of Kiel and Sarah I saw no sign. Of the overseers none remained, only corpses and the slow drip of blood from the walls. I was alone, free, and yet not free.
This is the brutal truth of life aboard a Chaos warship.
There is no life, only a slow descent. Every heartbeat a choice between surrender and annihilation. You do not live here, you endure. You do not thrive, you are consumed. I began as a conscript of the Astra Militarum, a faceless number in an uncaring ledger. I became a prisoner of chaos, a survivor among horrors that should never exist. And in the end, survival itself was my curse. For every day I remain, the whispers grow louder. Every shadow promises power. Every silence begs me to kneel. Kale found his path, and it devoured him. Sira chose hers, and she was unmade. I chose resistance. But in truth, how long can I hold? How long before the ship, the gods, on my own hunger drag me into the abyss? The Emperor's light burns eternal, so they say. Yet here, in the bowels of the Harbinger of Ruin, that light feels very far away. The endless war does not end, and aboard this vessel there is no victory, only survival and the slow unraveling of what it means to be human. The Emperor protects. More stories await.